Okay, this is a lecture on Galatians. We're just going to basically go through kind of the main areas of kind of the historical context of the writing of the book. So let's start talking about author. The letter claims to have been written by Paul. It's in that first verse of chapter 1, and the claim rings true. It's the outpouring of a concerned evangelist and pastor over some tragic false teaching that has arisen among his converts. As Kummel says, and here's a quote, that Galatians is a genuine, authentic epistle is indisputable. So far more disputed is the question of how Paul saw himself when he wrote, as a Jew, though a Christian Jew, or as a convert to a new religion, and thus, in some sense, no longer a Jew. Some people think that Paul is abandoning his Jewish identity in favor of a Christian identity. Let's talk about provenance. There are two major options, and I'm going to lay them out a little more further on, but the most likely place of provenance is Antioch, the city from which Paul set out on his missionary tours and to which he had returned after his first tour, the tour in which he founded the Galatian churches. Finding the earlier date of AD 48 to be the most convincing option, this would mean that Paul wrote from Antioch as he was witnessing there already the pressure to force Gentile believers to adopt the practices of covenant law in order to be granted acceptance within the circle of Jewish Christians. This kind of pressure was already evident in Antioch. And Paul talks about it in Galatians, how he had to confront Peter about it and those kinds of things. Having heard that such efforts had reached the churches he had just planted in the southern regions of Galatia, he wrote this letter in response. And we'll flesh out other options as we go on. So let's talk about recipients. Who was this letter addressed to? During the 3rd century BC, some Gauls migrated to the inner plateau of Asia Minor and established a kingdom. Under Amyntas, Amyntas, in the 1st century BC, the kingdom extended to Pisidia, Lycaonia, and other places in the southern part of what is now Turkey, and most of the immigrants remained when, on the death of Amyntas in 25 BC, the Romans took over and made it into the province of Galatia. The problem for us is whether the term Galatians, to which this epistle is addressed, refers to ethnic Galatians in the north of the province, or to the southerners of various races who were included in the Roman province. Toward the end of the 3rd century, the southern area was detached and the province was reduced to the northern section. Traditionally, Galatia has thus been understood as the northern area. But was this the way Paul used the term? The apostle had visited the southern area on his first missionary journey. We see that in Acts 13 and 14. But he is never explicitly said to have visited the northern area, though many think that this is what is meant in Acts 16:6 and 18:23. In favor of South Galatia as the area that we have in mind, please note these 10 considerations. Number 1, we have information about the people and places Paul knew and visited in the southern region, but none at all in the north. At best, Acts 16:6 and 18:23 may indicate work in the north, but neither passage says that Paul founded any churches there. This is in striking contrast to his work in other areas. If Paul was writing to people in the north, we would expect some firm indication that he had been there at some time. It would be curious, to say the least, to have no information about churches to which such an important letter was sent. And if it's churches he didn't found, how does he have the freedom to exercise the kind of authority with which he addresses them and rebukes them for so quickly abandoning the gospel they've received? Number 2, the unusual expression, the region of Phrygia and Galatia, through which Paul traveled, mentioned in Acts 16:6, is best understood as the area through which the apostle would go when he left Lystra and Iconium in 16:2, that is, the Phrygo-Galatic territory. Those who hold the North Galatian theory take this to mean Phrygia and the Galatian country, as though they're two separate things. Ernst Henken, that's Henchen, Ernst, Ernst, he argues that Phrygia is an adjective of two terminations and cannot qualify the chora, or land, or region in the phrase. But C.J. Hammer, Hemer, has shown conclusively that it has three terminations and thus may well qualify the word. F.F. Bruce's careful examination yields the conclusion that the expression can mean only, and here's the quote, the territory through which Paul and his friends passed after leaving Lystra, the territory in which Iconium and Pisidian Antioch were situated, end quote. The similar expression in Acts 18:23 seems to mean much the same. A third consideration. Paul normally, though not invariably, uses Roman imperial names for the provinces, and Galatians would be the way he would refer to people in Lycaonia and other districts. A fourth argument. Galatians was the only word available that embraced the people in all the cities of the first missionary journey. Antioch, Pisidian Antioch, Lystra, Iconium, and Derbe. If Paul wrote the letter to churches in 4 different cities, how else could he address one singular heading to all 4, if not by using the name of the Roman province they were all a part of? Number 5. Paul speaks of the Galatian churches as included among the contributors to his collection for the believers in Jerusalem in 1 Corinthians 16:1. And in Acts 24, Luke lists a Berean, 2 Thessalonians, 2 South Galatians, and 2 Asians who look suspiciously like the party bearing the gift. But Luke does not actually say so, so in any case, there are no Corinthians in the list, so it may be incomplete. Still, that does seem to point in that direction. 6. The northern part of the country was not opened up like the southern area, through which a continual stream of commerce flowed. In Galatians 4:13, Paul talks about because of an illness. It's unlikely that Paul reached them in this difficult mountainous country because of an illness. A convalescent would look for a place of much easier access. Number 7, it is urged that it is unlikely that Paul's Jewish opponents would have pursued him into this difficult northern country, and much more likely that they would have followed him into the southern cities. But how fanatical were they? Number 8, the words, "You welcomed me as if I were an angel of God, as if I were Christ Jesus himself," from Galatians 4:14, are said to be an allusion to Paul being welcomed as Hermes in Lystra. We read of this in Acts 14:12. This is somewhat spoiled, however, by the fact that afterward the Lystrans stoned him, though this too is sometimes taken up into the argument with a reference to Galatians 6:17, when he talks about bearing the marks of Jesus in his body. The fact that he was welcomed as an angel is also sometimes used as an argument the opposite way. Paul could not have looked much like an angel when he came to the Galatians as a sick man. Number 9, Ramsay, who did more than anybody to establish the Southern theory, argued that the church developed along the great lines of communication, and these went through the southern parts of Galatia, not the north. And number 10, Barnabas is mentioned 3 times in chapter 2, verses 1, 19, and 13, which seems to mean that he was known to the readers, but he accompanied Paul only on the journey when the South Galatian churches were established. It is objected that Barnabas is mentioned in 1 Corinthians 9:6, though we have no evidence that he was ever in Corinth. We should also bear in mind that Peter is mentioned. Galatians 2, 7 and 8 mention Peter, though there is no evidence that he has ever been in the north. The point carries little weight. And let's look at some arguments for those who favor North Galatia as the area being referenced. And there are 8 reasons suggested. 1, in the speech of the day, Galatia meant the place inhabited by the Gauls in the north. against this, as we have seen, is that it was also used as the Roman designation for the whole province. In Acts, this is number 2, in Acts, Antioch is called Pisidian, Acts 13:14, while Lystra and Derbe are cities of Lycaonia, in Acts 14:6. Luke, it is said, uses such terms to denote geographic locations. Thus, when he refers to the region of Phrygia and Galatia in Acts 16:6, we must understand him to mean geographic Phrygia and geographic Galatia, that is, North Galatia. So the argument is, if you look at Paul's use of geographic terminology, then he wouldn't use Galatia to refer to the southern region. But, of course, we're actually not talking about Luke's language. We're talking about Paul's language in the letter. Paul is using the term Galatians, and that's what we're trying to identify here. I'm not sure that Luke's usage would have much bearing on the letter. Number 3, Galatia would not be used of Phrygians and the like because it would remind them of their subjection to Rome. This, however, is hardly valid. Paul referred to himself as a Roman citizen, and he was from near that area. In any case, Galatia was the only term that covered all the cities mentioned. Some have pointed out that in modern times, with an audience of Welsh, Scots, and English people, we would address them as British and none of them would object. That's the only term that covers them all. So with ancient Galatia. But anyway, continuing with objections. Number 4, a similar objection is that Paul could not possibly have addressed Lycaonians or Pisidians as calling them, "O foolish Galatians," in chapter 3, verse 1, particularly since this linguistic usage is generally not attested. In a counterpoint, what usage is attested? As noticed in the previous section, Galatians was the only term available to cover all the inhabitants of this province. Number 5, the fickle and superstitious character of the Galatians suits a Gallic origin. But again, that way of describing them can hardly be applied only to Galatians. Consider the Corinthians, for example, who seem to be very similar. Okay. Number 6, the region of Phrygia and Galatia, from Acts 16:6 and 18:23, is understood to mean Phrygia and the Galatian region, which is taken to mean that Galatia was quite distinct from Phrygia, and presumably other districts, such as Lycaonia. But as we have seen, the probable meaning is the Phrygio-Galatic territory. In other words, kind of hyphenating the two as the two making up the one territory. It does not establish a clear distinction. Point number 7, Paul writes, "Later I went to Syria and Sicilia," in Galatians 1:21. Markson comments, according to the South Galatian hypothesis, he must have founded the Galatian churches at that time, but there's no mention of this. But because Syria and Cilicia were not in the province of Galatia, this is irrelevant. It appears to refer to a different trip from that on which Paul had founded the churches of southern Galatia, some trip made in a period subsequent to Acts 9:30. And number 8, there is not the slightest hint in Galatians that Paul had experienced strong opposition when he preached in the Galatian cities. But Acts makes it clear that there was persecution in most of the cities the apostle visited, even if he didn't spell out specific instances in the Galatian, in the Pisidium, Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe. From all this, it appears that there's no final proof for either the North or South Galatian theory, but it surely seems that while the South Galatian theory comes short of complete demonstration, the arguments in its favor are considerably more compelling than those for North Galatia. So it seems most likely that Paul addresses this letter to the churches of Pisidian Antioch, Lycaonia, Lystra, and Derbe. So let's talk about the date. The chronology that Paul lays out in Galatians 1:15 through 2:10 has been the topic of intense debate among scholars. The key phrase is found in chapter 2, verse 1. "After 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem." The discussion focuses on when we are to begin counting those 14 years. Paul's conversion likely occurred sometime around AD 34. After describing his conversion, Paul mentions a visit to Jerusalem after 3 years in chapter 1, verse 18, which would have occurred around AD 37. So in chapter 2, verse 1, does Paul mean 14 years after his conversion, that is, sometime near or around AD 48? Or 14 years after that first visit to Jerusalem, which would put it more like around AD 51? If we count from his conversion, then his second visit would be the famine relief visit described in Acts 11, perhaps taking place in AD 47. That somewhat compresses Paul's 14 years. That famine relief visit occurred just before Paul and Barnabas went out on their first missionary tour, which was AD 47 to 48, the one on which they had planted the churches in southern Galatia. Paul then would be writing the letter sometime in AD 48 after his return to Antioch and perhaps just before the Jerusalem Council took place. If we count from the first Jerusalem visit, then Paul is writing after the Jerusalem Council, which took place in AD 48, and the Jerusalem Council, people say, would be that second visit 14 years later. Why Paul says nothing of the famine relief visit of Acts 11 is unclear if this is the case. Though Paul mentions nothing about the Jerusalem Council's decision in his letter to the Galatians, this doesn't help us solve the issue of when he wrote it, because there had to have been other reasons he says nothing about the Jerusalem Council's decision. Paul never mentions the Jerusalem Council's decision in any of his letters, and clearly he wrote most of them after the Jerusalem Council, if not all. And added to this is the discussion surrounding the very term Galatians. If you adopt the North Galatian theory, then because Paul could not have spent enough time ministering in the North to plant churches until about halfway through his recorded missionary service, the date of Galatians, which of course must have been written after the planting of the church, has to be later than that. About the same time as perhaps Paul's letter to Rome in AD 57. If the South Galatian theory is adopted, an early date is possible around AD 48. An early date is supported by such considerations as the following. In protesting that he had a divine commission, this is reason one. In protesting that he had a divine commission and not one derived from any human source, chapter 1, verse 12, Paul lists his contacts with the Jerusalem apostles. These include a visit to Peter in 1:18, then after 14 years, a visit again in response to a revelation, chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. Again, the word again indicates a second visit. These correspond to the visits in Acts 9:29 and in 11:28 through 30, which that relief visit does happen in response to a vision. A prophecy from somebody that says there's going to be a famine, and that's when the church sends Paul and Barnabas to Jerusalem. Paul's list must be complete, else his argument would be vitiated. Reason number 2, Paul does not mention the decree of the Council of Jerusalem, which would have been very suitable for his purpose. This suggests a visit before the council, though the point cannot be pressed unduly, as the apostle does not mention the decree in other letters that are demonstrably later. A third reason, Peter's withdrawal from the table of fellowship with the Gentiles in chapter 2, verse 12, is more likely to have been before rather than after the council. And that does seem like a weighty argument, because after the Jerusalem Council, it would seem to be settled that circumcision is a non-issue. And reason 4, the early date is not invalidated by Paul's words, I first, to proteron, preached the gospel to you, which some suggest means on the first of my 2 visits, and points to a date later than Paul's second missionary journey. In classical Greek, the expression means on the former of 2 occasions, but in Hellenistic Greek, it signifies formerly, in the past, as in John 6:62 or John 9:8 or Hebrews 4:6, and etc. In any case, Paul visited his South Galatian churches twice during his first expedition, see Acts 14:21, so that even if the Greek expression is taken to mean on the first of my two visits, the second visit may have been the return swing on his first missionary journey rather than something later. Reason number 5. In the flow of Paul's thought, it seems unlikely that the fiery words of Galatians would be penned at the same time as his thoughtful exposition of the gospel for the Roman churches, and would seem somewhat at odds with the conciliatory nature of his great offering for the saints that he was traveling back to Jerusalem to deliver. The anger and frustration evident in Galatians make most sense at the opening of his Gentile mission, not at its close. In contrast, a date during Paul's third missionary tour, sometime between 52 and 57, is favored by many. The early date is excluded by those who hold the North Galatian theory, for on this view, Paul had not been to Galatia twice until this time. A later date is supported by such arguments as these. 1. The style and thoughts expressed show an affinity with the Corinthian correspondence and with Romans. So the epistle of Galatians accordingly should be dated close to them, say at Ephesus during Paul's third missionary journey in Acts 19, or even on the subsequent journey through Greece. A second reason. The visit to Jerusalem in Galatians 2 is so closely connected with the subject matter of the Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15 that the two must be regarded as independent accounts of the same visit. Though some who favor the South Galatian theory see these as two different visits and simply hold that Paul wrote later than the council. Those who hold to the later date reason that Paul in his account in Galatians 1:18 through 2:2 did not include any mention of the famine visit of Acts 11:30 because on that occasion his business was with the elders, not the apostles. Reason number 3, since Paul has already visited Galatia twice, chapter 4, verse 13, the most likely visits are those of Acts 16:6 and 18:23. But we have already seen that the language does not necessarily mean two visits. And even if it does, the reference may be to the outbound and the return visits of the first missionary journey. Reason number 4, in 1 Corinthians, there is little about persecution, but there is much in 2 Corinthians. Romans is calm. Evidently, the trouble is largely in the past. Galatians fits into this sequence between 2 Corinthians and Romans. That would be the argument. The main point at issue is whether Paul is writing before or after the Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15. Those who advocate a late date say that he writes later, and some of them emphasize what they see as discrepancies between Acts and Paul's letters. They hold that Paul would never have accepted such an arrangement as the Council of Jerusalem reached. They hold that Paul would never have accepted such an arrangement as the Council of Jerusalem reached according to the description in Acts. Indeed, they find his recollection of what happens in Galatians 2. They point out that though they are treated from different points of view, in both accounts the points at issue are circumcision and the relation of the Christians to the law. So these would take a very hostile view of Paul and the Jerusalem, so that what we read in Galatians about Paul rebuking Peter and all that is kind of his take on the Jerusalem council. Others, and I would say I don't find that convincing. I don't think that's what Paul is talking about in Galatians. Others who accept the North Galatian view think that Acts and Galatians can be reconciled, but this entails the conclusion that Paul has omitted one of his visits to Jerusalem, the famine relief visit. Certainly it is simpler and less arbitrary to accept both accounts. On balance, it seems best to hold that Paul's two visits to Jerusalem are those of Acts 9 and 11. Galatians 2 will refer to private contacts on the famine visit in this view. It is hard to date Peter's vacillation after Acts 15, after the Jerusalem Council, and that Paul wrote Galatians just prior to the Jerusalem Council. If the council is rightly dated AD 49, then AD 48 is the date of Galatians. That the letter precedes the Jerusalem Council seems indicated by the fact that Paul makes no mention of its verdict. Even if he did not make it his main argument, it is hard to see why he would omit all mention of such a significant support to his argument against accepting the whole Jewish Torah. And one could argue, even if Paul didn't quite agree with the dietary restrictions, he could point to the fact that the Jerusalem leaders had very unequivocally already agreed that circumcision was not a requirement. And again, given that he never mentions this in any of his later letters, it's dangerous to make arguments from what Paul chose not to say. Let's talk about the situation. From Acts 13 and 14, we learn that Paul and Barnabas evangelized the southern part of the province of Galatia by going first to the synagogues where they preached to Jews and God-fearing Gentiles. But in each city, Jews stirred up opposition, and the preachers turned to the Gentiles and made converts from among them. We need not doubt that, if the North Galatian theory were correct, the evangelization of the northern areas was brought about in much the same way. Throughout the region, the church was predominantly Gentile. But after Paul and Barnabas left the scene, apparently some Jewish Christians came into the area and taught that those who embraced the Christian salvation must submit to Jewish law, the Torah. So far as we know, local Jews did not teach this. They simply opposed the Christians. Paul distinguishes the false teachers from the congregation. Chapter 1, verse 7, chapter 4, verse 17, and so on. Perhaps they had a strong leader. If you look at chapter 1, verse 9, or chapter 5, verse 10. Indeed, he can imply that they were not Christians at all, chapter 1, verses 6 and 7. Their emphasis on keeping Mosaic law makes it almost certain they were Jews. Doubtless, they thought of themselves as Jewish Christians. Paul is prepared to question the Christian component if they set up as necessary to salvation any rival to Jesus. From Galatians, we gather that Paul's authority was undermined by the argument that he was inferior to the earlier apostles. Paul seems to have this in mind from first to last, sent not with a human commission nor by human authority, but by Jesus Christ and God the Father. Chapter 1, verse 1. Let no one cause me trouble, for I bear on my body the marks of Jesus. Chapter 6, verse 17. Circumcision was insisted on. They are trying to compel you to be circumcised, chapter 6, verse 12. See also chapter 5, verses 2 through 6. Paul points out that the acceptance of circumcision means the acceptance of the obligation to carry out the whole law of which it is a part, chapter 5, verse 3. Whatever the false teachers may have said, the keeping of the law was apparently insisted on, for he also writes, "You are observing special days and months and seasons and years," chapter 4, verse 10. He also speaks of his converts as wanting to be under the law, chapter 4:21, and as trying to be justified by the law, chapter 5, verse 4. Putting all this together, it seems that the false teachers saw Christianity as a modified Judaism. They were teaching that to be in covenant relationship to God means to submit to the requirements of the law. Therefore, they were persuading the Galatians to submit to the way of the law instead of enjoying freedom in Christ. In recent years, some have argued that all or at least most of the laws that these interlopers were pressing on the Galatians were the legislative pieces that established boundary markers, the practices that differentiated Jews from other people, in particular circumcision, food laws, and Sabbath. Paul wants those things dropped because he wants to build a unified church composed of Jew and Gentile alike, and the boundary markers inevitably provoke division. Certainly, Paul is constantly at pains to unite Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians. Nevertheless, this new perspective on Paul is too narrow. Paul casts the function of the law in more sweeping terms than boundary markers, not least in its capacity to establish transgression. Chapter 3, verse 19. And he ties the heart of his debate to the exclusive sufficiency of the cross of Christ to see a person declared just before God. This debate has generated a correlative discussion about the extent to which Paul sees himself to be a Jew and his movement as a kind of sect within the fold of Judaism, or, conversely, sees himself as belonging to what is in effect a new religion. And this new perspective on Paul is kind of this idea that Paul is focusing on these markers that separate Jew from Gentile by these key things, circumcision, diet, and Sabbath. But if you look at Paul's argumentation, he's not focusing on things that might create divisions. He's focusing much deeper than that on how exactly are we made right with God? What exactly did Christ accomplish at the cross? I mean, it's a whole lot more than just the expediency of eliminating these religious practices that are causing divisions. Whether or not they were Christians in Paul's eyes, the false teachers evidently sprang from the Jewish Christian camp. Christians had opposed Peter in Acts 11, 2 and 3. And at a later time, James could speak of many thousands of Jews who believed, and all of them are zealous for the law, Acts 21, verse 20. Clearly, there was a strong group of these people, and at least on occasion, they could be active propagandists, as when they went from Judea to Antioch and taught the new converts, unless you are circumcised according to the custom taught by Moses, you cannot be saved, Acts 15, verse 1. If they followed Paul to Antioch, it is not unlikely that they followed him to Galatia. They may not have been many in number, for Paul writes, "A little yeast works through the whole batch of dough," Galatians 5:9. Sometimes it is contended that Paul's opponents were Gentiles who had accepted circumcision and wanted others to do the same. But this supposition scarcely outweighs the evidence that there were zealous Jewish Christians anxious to insist on the law. G. Howard thinks that they may not have been opponents in the strict sense, but that they claimed that Paul was really teaching what they taught. The vehemence with which Paul opposes them makes this unlikely. Libertinism is sometimes detected, consider chapter 5, verse 13 and following, with such exhortations as, "Do not use your freedom to indulge the sinful nature," or the flesh, chapter 5, verse 13. And "walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh," chapter 5, verse 16. But it is better to see this as a perversion of Paul's teaching that in Christ believers are free. In every age, it has been easy to deduce that if we are saved by grace, it does not matter how we live. One suspects that the agitators were decrying Paul's teaching as inadequately safeguarding moral probity. But if their solution But if their solution to this perennial challenge was a return to the Mosaic Law covenant, the price was too high. It betrayed an inability to grasp how the law properly functioned across the sweep of redemptive history. Criticisms of Paul seem to have been made. "If I am still preaching circumcision," chapter 5, verse 11, appears to mean that Paul had been accused of preaching circumcision when it suited him. See, for example, his circumcision of Timothy in Acts 16:3. And this despite the fact that he insisted that Titus not be circumcised, chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. Am I now trying to win human approval or God's approval? Or am I trying to please people? Chapter 1, verse 10. This indicates that some were saying the apostle was simply interested in human approval. In the life of a man who became all things to all people, including becoming like a Jew in order to win the Jews, 1 Corinthians 9, 20 through 22, there could not lack incidents that gave opponents the opening to charge him with inconsistency. The gospel was seriously compromised by this new teaching. Paul complains that his correspondents were turning to a different gospel, immediately adding, which is really no gospel at all, chapter 1, 6, and 7. What the Galatians were in danger of doing was not adding some interesting new insights into the meaning of Christianity, but to returning to the law covenant in such a way that the climactic triumph of the gospel was completely erased. The epistle to the Galatians is the result of news of these happenings reaching Paul. He immediately recognized what his converts were doing meant, that they were renouncing the heart of the Christian way, and he wrote straightaway a correction to the situation. He did not observe all the niceties of correct letter writing, but sent off an impassioned appeal to the Galatians to return to the faith in which they had been saved. This lively letter has become a classic expression of the meaning of justification by faith in Christ alone. And finally, what is the purpose of this letter? Paul's urgency as he pens this letter cannot be missed. After so much effort, he is panicked at the thought that others could come in behind him and undermine all that he has done. He has come to understand that Christ has done what the law of Moses only alluded to, illustrated through its cult and ritual. Christ has actually propitiated for human sin, for the sins of the world. This is the gospel he has encountered, the gospel he has shared. But others have come in behind him to tweak the gospel message in such a way that it becomes little more than a supplement to the covenant of the law. Paul responds to accusations that he has invented the gospel message, that it is a human invention of his own. No, the gospel is God's work revealed by Jesus Christ. Paul himself confesses that he once opposed and persecuted the faith, but he encountered the risen Christ and was forever changed by the encounter. Paul writes this letter to convince his readers in the churches of Galatia to hold fast to Christ and to find their security and their salvation in him alone, not in any work of the law that they might perform. Paul knows this might seem to validate sinful living, a reliance on the forgiveness extended at the cross that leads to complacency about living in sin. From Scripture, using the example of Abraham and the words found in the Torah, Paul argues that salvation has only ever worked through faith, that it has never been a matter of our works, our merits. The law provided us guidance and prepared us to receive Christ in faith. Now that we are under the care of Christ, we have been freed from the law. But Paul is careful to remind his readers that this freedom is not a license to sin. It is the freedom to pursue righteousness unhindered by inner impulse rather than the external prohibition or commandment. Though he knows the right understanding of the gospel might lead to a libertine heresy, Paul understands that the alternative of works-based salvation is just as damning as a descent into hedonism. Only true faith in the sufficiency of Christ, in the promise of salvation extended at the cross, can sustain a life of holiness and secure eternal redemption.